Hey everybody, it's Eugene Lisho, and welcome to Forensics Talks. This is episode 55, and today my guest is Jeremiah Morris, who's going to be speaking to us about the scientific foundations of BPA. Now, don't forget, we're going to be live streaming to YouTube, Facebook, and LinkedIn, so let us know in the chat window where you're from. If you have any questions, by all means, just go ahead and pop them in there. I just got a couple of announcements to do here before we get started. And the first one is that I'm hosting a photogrammetry course that's coming up on February 22nd and 23rd. Okay, so that's February, that's just around the corner. And if you're using a digital camera to document evidence and you want to learn how to turn that into a 3D model to take measurements for analysis or whatever, then this is the course for you. I go from zero to hero. So basically taking you right from the basics right up to creating 3D models, creating animations, being able to take measurements and that sort of thing. Also, I'll be giving away a full version of 3ds Zephyr. And if you look for that online, it's a great program and it's several $1,000s value. So it's a great opportunity for those of you who are new or getting into photogrammetry. Also, I want to announce that we are having a conference, the IAFSM and ACER. So that's International Association of Forensic and Security Metrology and the Association of Crime Scene Reconstruction are hosting their annual conference. It's a joint conference on February 14th to 28th. And there's a lot of really cool stuff that they're going to be doing next week. And probably the big one is going to be a mock mass casualty exercise held at the First Bank Center Arena in Denver, Colorado. There's also a basic laser scanner certification course that I'll be teaching on the Sunday. And in line with what we're going to be talking about today, which is bloodstain pattern analysis, I'll be hosting a cast-off pattern analysis workshop. So if you're in the area or you're still interested, go ahead, look at the website, reach out, and I'm sure that they'd be happy to have you. Finally, just one more thing, and that is that a colleague of mine, Gareth Griffiths, has a research study related to bloodstain pattern analysis. And what I'd like to do is I'm going to put this into the chat window here. I'm going to put the link in there, and it's a survey. And if you're interested or if you can help out, by all means, please click on the link and go ahead and fill it out, help him out. It's always for a good cause when it's for research. All right, well, let's get started here. So as I mentioned, my guest is Jeremiah Morris, affectionately known as Jeremy, and he's a certified bloodstain pattern analyst through the International Association of Identification. He's the Forensic Scientist Supervisor, Trace Evidence and Crime Scene Investigation Technical Leader of Trace Evidence and Bloodstain Pattern Analysis at the Johnson County Sheriff's Office Criminalistics Laboratory. He's a member of several forensic organizations, such as the Midwestern Association of Forensic Scientists, the International Association for Identification, and the IABPA, that's the International Association of Bloodstain Pattern Analysts. Jeremy is the editor of the Journal of Bloodstain Pattern Analysis and the Journal of the American Society of Trace Evidence Examiners. He's a past member of the BPA subcommittee of the Organization of Scientific Area Committees, so that's the OSAC groups, and he's given several presentations in the past on scientific foundations of BPA. And I thought recently he raised some really, really excellent points, and I want to ask him some questions about that today. So let me bring him in here. Hey, Jeremy, how you doing?
I'm doing great. How are you doing?
Excellent. Thank you so much for being here today.
Oh, it's my pleasure.
The first question I have for you is sort of winding the clock back, and before you were a forensic scientist and before you got into all this, what was Jeremy doing, or what was your path into forensics?
Oh, my path is kind of a fortuitous one. When I was in high school, we took a band tour to Washington, D.C., and part of our trip is we visited the FBI crime lab. And I didn't know forensics, didn't know what a crime lab was. And one of the scientists was talking about all the things that you could do with a single hair and all the determinations. So that was my introduction to forensics. At the time, I wanted to be a doctor. I was thinking about being a medical examiner. And by the time my senior year came around in high school, I was still looking into medical school, but found a cute little girl that I didn't really want to wait a long time with medical school, and decided to drop medical school and just get a degree in chemistry. And I thought working in a crime lab sounded pretty fun. So I went into college wanting to work in a crime lab, did an internship after my freshman year at the Kansas Bureau of Investigation in their toxicology section. Absolutely loved it. That solidified my interest in working in a crime lab, and got a job right after I graduated with the Missouri State Highway Patrol, working as a drug chemist.
Excellent.
So
When was your first exposure to bloodstain pattern analysis? Like, when was the first time that you said, "Hey, this is something I got to learn. This is something that, there's some value here"?
So when I was with the Highway Patrol as a drug chemist, we had, a library with all sorts of books, and one day I was perusing it. We didn't go to crime scenes, but I saw one of the earlier books by Stuart James on BPA, and it was just really interesting. I kind of perused through it, just kind of set it down. Then when I got hired by Johnson County in 2003, all bench scientists were assigned to the crime scene team. So I went to a 3-week crime scene school, and Kevin Weiner taught a 1-day section on BPA, and that really, really, really interested me. So then we had a couple scenes where we had blood stains that we didn't know anything to do with them. We knew that there was value, but that we didn't have a blood stain team. So I asked my director if I could start up a blood stain team, and 3 of us went to a basic workshop, and in 2005, and that was the start.
Awesome. Well, let me ask you about BPA, and we're obviously going to get into this here. I've seen before that when you often start talking about in your presentations and such, you talk about source and event conclusions.
Right.
You often before you get into like what is BPA, and so I'm going to ask you the same thing. Like, what's the
Right.
significance between source and event conclusions?
So a source conclusion is we have an item of evidence, and we want to know where it came from. And there are a lot of disciplines that can answer that. So if we have a fingerprint, then the latent print community can analyze that and compare it to known standards to try and determine where that print came from. Same thing with footwear and tire tracks, to link that evidence or that trace of material to a source. DNA is the same thing. And even in trace evidence, that I also work here at the crime lab for hairs and fibers and paint and duct tape. So that would be a source conclusion. So that tells you where it came from, but sometimes it doesn't really tell you how it got there. And specifically with blood. So with DNA, the DNA analysts would do an outstanding job in running the samples, comparing them to submitted knowns, and coming up with their results on linking it or associating it to a person. But it doesn't tell you how it got there. And the how it got there is going to be the event conclusion. And that's kind of the history of that. So there are other disciplines that can potentially touch on source conclusions. Perhaps even in DNA, they'll ask, is this amount of DNA that you found, is it consistent with this kind of action or that kind of action? So they can give some interpretation on that. With paint exams, we can look at some of the paint exams and see if it's a chip or a smear or if it's an overspray. So get some level of source conclusions, but BPA is really kind of, as well as kind of shooting incident reconstruction, now you're kind of telling a little bit more of the history of it, answering the how question, not the where question.
Right. So how do you frame or how do you respond to questions like, for example, if you're at trial and you're trying to explain it to a jury or something like that, what is BPA? Like, what's the best way that you explain it?
I say that the blood stains tell a story. I will look at the stains that are left at a scene or left on evidence that's submitted for analysis, and those blood stains can tell a story. And so whenever I go into a crime scene where I'm looking at evidence, I'm really just reading the story of the blood stains. But that story is a fragmented story. That story will tell of events and people and places, but it's not like a movie. When we think of a movie, we think of step-by-step actions that are very specific, that a person started in this location and walked over to this location and raised their right hand and so on. With BPA, it's a fragmented story. So instead of looking at a movie, think of photographs. So I have a snapshot of an action here, and I have a snapshot of an action there. So I can give you pieces, but if I were to give you 10 photographs, and you might be able to orient those photographs in the location. But now if I ask you to put them in sequence, that becomes a little more problematic. There might be some indicators in the photographs that you can sequence the order of those photographs, but there may be times where you just simply don't know. So that shows that the uncertainty in some of our conclusions is that we have to be willing to say, I simply don't know, because it really is that fragmented story.
Right. And I mean, BPA has come a long way, but who were some of the early people who really brought BPA to, the courts, or showing that it was useful, and just bringing it to prominence?
So here in the United States, the name that comes up all the time is Herbert McTenelle. He wasn't the first one that brought it back up, but he wrote a booklet that talked about flight dynamics of blood, and then he kind of went across the country and was teaching these what have become very well known 40-hour workshops or introductory courses about BPA. He testified to it. Before him, there was Paul Kirk, who testified in the Sam Shepard trial, and he did some initial work on it. So those are the two that really kind of brought it to the attention to the United States. But we had scientists that were in the U.S. and over in Europe that have been looking and studying for blood stains for over a century. When we look at the published research, but it really didn't start to be used a lot, at least in investigations, until the 1970s and going into the 1980s.
Yeah. A few years back, I think it was at the IABP conference in Chicago. I'm going to say it was Chicago, but there was a gentleman there who did a presentation, and I don't remember if there was a keynote or whatever, but in his talk, he really pointed out the fact that bloodstain pattern analysis is a difficult discipline. It's one of those disciplines that isn't just making an identification, right? It's not just black and white. There's a lot of complexity. So I want to ask you, in your mind, what makes BPA complex? What makes it difficult?
There's so many unknowns. I mean, we're asked to look at these blood stains, and it's just a challenge. Another way that I describe BPA is this. Think of how you typically put a puzzle together. We'll get the box and we'll dump all the pieces onto a table, and then we take the box top and we put it off to the side, because the box top tells us where we're going. And we know what the final picture is supposed to look like. So if we have a puzzle piece and we don't quite know where it goes, we can go to the box top and compare it. Now, think of it this: let's say I gave you 100 pieces out of a 1,000-piece puzzle, and I didn't give you the box top. Now it's very, very challenging. You don't know where you're going. You don't know what the final picture is supposed to be. You can make some connections. You might make some orientations. You got some edges and border pieces and some other things, but there's going to be a lot of unknowns. And that's really the challenge, is that we're looking at these pieces and we don't really have a full understanding of what the box top looks like. So we have to make our guesses. And then we are still learning so much about this science, the interaction of blood with fabrics and the limitations to that. And I think for me as an analyst, I went into my first basic workshop and got introduced to it, and they show us the really, really easy stuff, and you walk out thinking, hey, I got this. This isn't that particularly difficult. And then you walk into your first scene like, oh my goodness, this is a hot mess. and then you start doing your own experiments, and you do something and you step back and you're like, I would have never guessed in 100 years that pattern would have been created by this action. So those are very humbling moments. And so it really is that unknown, and just being humble enough to realize that there's a lot more information out there that you simply don't know.
Yeah. I mean, so you started doing this, I'm going to say back in early to mid 2000s?
Yeah, 2005 is when my introductory course was.
Okay. So going back to 2005 and then coming up today, 2009, there was the NAS report, talking about, different disciplines and criticizing different disciplines. And I'm pretty sure BPA was one of those disciplines. And then we hear the term, junk science and things like that. Have you seen a progression and sort of a positive progression of BPA over the years?
Yes, I have. One of the big things is that we're starting to come down to a common language, and that common language when it comes to classifying patterns, and it's taking these stains and these arrangements of stains and connecting them to a mechanism. We've kind of landed on the same words and those same terms, and that's incredibly helpful. And it's because the community has finally decided we need to fix this problem. And here's kind of an example. The word projected can be used in a number of different ways. Some people use it to just talk about the blood's in flight, that you have liquid blood, force was applied to it, and that blood is projected onto a surface. And for me, when I use the term projected pattern, I'm talking about blood that's essentially being pushed out by hydraulic pressure, a breached artery. If we're using the same word, but using it in two completely different ways, we're using a different language, and that causes a lot of confusion. Mm-hmm. So settling on a common language and common terms and getting rid of things that were problematic, terms that were problematic in the past, is a really, really large step. We've had a lot of researchers that have jumped in since the 2009 report and have really opened our eyes. The study on textiles has been outstanding. In incorporating more concepts of fluid dynamics has been really, really important because it's answering a lot of questions. One of the questions is how far will a blood droplet fly? And sometimes that can be really, really important. And people would say, well, you have to be within 4 feet in order to get these stains on you. And what we're finding out is we kind of made that answer up, is what we did. And we're finding that when we look at the theory of fluid dynamics and incorporate drag and viscosity and all this, that we can get a better understanding that sometimes bloodstains can fly a lot further than what we thought. Yeah, what you've got there is the ASB document. This is the second generation of the terminology. Swig Stain issued a terminology list in 2009. And ASB adopted it and kind of modified it. I was part of Swig Stain in the terminology group, and then when OSAC started, I was on the chair of the OSAC terminology task group that we looked at this document, looked at the terms, and we modified some of them, made them a little better, a little more consistent. We dropped a few of them because we felt that they were problematic. But
okay.
Yeah, that's the document right now that is our guide for the terms that we use.
Are there still any words that are sticking points with some people? Are there still some things where people, even in, for example, North America here, where sort of one person uses it one way and somebody uses the other way?
Projected is probably the big one, and it's just understanding that when someone says blood that went in airborne and landed on a surface, I use spatter stains for that force applied to blood and makes it go airborne. For me, that's a spatter stain. If we start talking to one another, we can pretty quickly figure out what they're talking about. But for non-scientists, that can be really confusing. Some people are still hanging on to high velocity, and medium velocity impact patterns. We abandoned those because there were some very clear scientific problems with that, and also they were very misleading. People were really kind of limiting high velocity impact spatter to just gunshot related spatter. But if you look at an expiration pattern or even some impact patterns, they look a lot like high velocity, and you can make a misclassification there. Mm-hmm. So we just abandoned those. All of those are just spatter stains.
Okay. Well, I want to start asking about the scientific sort of aspect of BPA. Mm-hmm. And the first one would be for me is what are the criteria for something being having a scientific foundation, and specifically to BPA? What are the scientific foundations of BPA?
Well, if we think of just the broader concept of science, a couple principles come out. Is it testable, and is it falsifiable? And we often don't think of that falsifiable one as being a hallmark of science, but it is. Not only do I need to be able to test it, but there needs to be some reasonable chance that I can falsify that theory or that hypothesis. So that needs to kind of drive BPA. And BPA, what it is it's a conglomeration of concepts from a lot of other different sciences. My degree is in chemistry and in biochemistry is what I have. So there are concepts that we can apply in chemistry and biochemistry. Chemistry-wise, we can use the presumptive tests and understand the chemical reactions that are involved in those chemical tests to that are based in chemistry, biochemistry, thinking about coagulation processes and dry times and things that would affect coagulation. Now we've got concepts of biochemistry. We can borrow concepts from anatomy and physiology, understanding the differences between an artery and a vein and how that affects the blood. Looking at injury dynamics that would be in medical examiners, the blunt force trauma and incised injuries and contusions and abrasions, which ones of those create blood stains and which ones don't. And then we can also look at mathematics and trigonometry and physics and fluid dynamics. We can pull those concepts and apply them specifically to what happens to liquid blood when force is applied. And then we can use concepts of logic, of inductive reasoning and deductive reasoning and abductive reasoning to help guide us into our interpretations of those bloodstains.
Okay. So would you say that, obviously photographs are really important to a bloodstain pattern analyst. So would you agree?
Absolutely. Yes, absolutely.
Yes. Okay. So one of the jobs is going to be that you need to classify patterns. That's a big deal, right? With training and that sort of thing.
Yes.
Okay. So the other aspect would be like when we start applying, the math and the physics, and then like doing things like area of origin analysis or convergence and things like this. So, but would you say that, classification would seem to me, it's probably what you do almost 100% of the time, even if you're not doing an area of origin, you still have to classify it at some point, no?
Right. Classification, and for those who aren't that familiar with BPA or still trying to understand it, it's linking that pattern that we see to how it was made, what mechanism was liquid blood struck with something, was someone shot, was someone cut, is it a bloody object came on contact with the surface, that mechanism or that manner in which that blood stain was created. And that's often the first question that we're asked is, or the first thing that we make a determination of is what mechanism created that. And virtually all of the published papers that are out there right now deal just with that pattern classification. Now you have the area of origin concepts, but when it comes to the two types of conclusions, the classification and then reconstructive statements, the vast majority of the papers that are out there deal with the pattern classification. And what that shows is it shows you how much more work we still have to do.
Yeah. Well, I wanted to start getting into some of the studies that have been done and maybe ask you some questions with respect
Absolutely.
to the differences between a person who's been trained, who's been certified, somebody with a significant level of experience versus somebody that might have just a basic class or whatever. There have been some studies I know that have looked at that, but can you comment on performance of people with proper training versus, just the average person or somebody that has very minimal training?
Right. So there are two studies that have been done out there when it comes to that question. Does training, essentially, is training very helpful? And both of them it's a resounding yes, that they're absolutely helpful. The training is absolutely essential in this. One study was done around 2009. It was done by a college student, I think out in Pennsylvania or Virginia area. And she just looked at people who were self-identified as experts and individuals who are lay people, and looking at 10 different patterns and classifying those and comparing the number of times an incorrect answer was given. And most of the time for lay people, they got it wrong. And the vast majority of the time for self-identified experts, they got it right. The second paper that was published came out at the end of 2020, and it came out of Australia, and it was Bloodstain Pattern Analysis, does experience equate to expertise? And that paper also did the same thing. It looked at not just self-identified experts, but people who've gone through a training program and compared those to lay people. Did a comparison and found out that there's a huge difference between the accuracy of those two different groups. So we've answered that question, that yes, training is absolutely important. Now, the next question is, how much training is important? And that becomes a little bit more problematic, and that gets a little fuzzier. There was one paper where looking at analyst characteristics as well as contextual information and how it affected conclusions. And in this particular study, they broke everyone who was involved in the study had gone through at least a 40-hour course. But if they'd just gone through a 40-hour course, they were considered a novice. And if they had gone through an advanced training and were also court qualified, then they were considered an expert. And those two groups of people looked at a single pattern. And what they found is that there was a clear difference. Of those who were experts, there was only a 4% error rate. Essentially one person missed it. But when they looked at the novices who had gone through a basic course, an introductory course, 40% of them got it wrong. So yeah, the majority of them got it right, but you still had a really high number of people who got it wrong. So for me, what that shows is that an introductory course is insufficient, and we've got a single paper that demonstrates that. And we also have kind of anecdotal information with some cases and talking with people, even if they're honest with themselves. Hey, after the 40-hour course, I thought I knew what I was doing, but then I took advanced courses and realized I didn't. So advanced courses is really important. But how much additional training do you need to have? A specific training program? How many hours of training? We still haven't broken that down. But what we do know is training beyond a 40-hour introductory course is really going to minimize the number of errors that you commit when it comes to just the basic concept of classifications.
Yeah, I know that different areas, even in Canada here, have different requirements for what they would consider, you're qualified, to testify or be an expert. Some are a little looser than others, and some are quite intense. Actually, some involve mentorship and on-the-job training, and for a period of time, a lot of peer review and everything else, which is great. What is the IAI's requirement, like in order to be certified? What do they ask for?
So I had to go through a couple of hundred hours worth of training. Now, I got certified 10 years ago, so I had to have, I think, like a week's worth of photography training. I had to have some basic crime scene training, and I think overall I had to have 250 to 300 hours, around a couple hundred hours worth of training just beyond the basic. I also had to have a certain time frame beyond my basic introductory course. I also had to demonstrate that I was doing coursework, and then I could apply for certification. And they've tweaked those, and I'll be honest, I haven't, since I'm already certified, I haven't looked at what the new requirements are, but they are much more than just the 40-hour introductory course. It's numerous hours of additional training beyond that.
Right. And when somebody's certified, like different agencies may have proficiency testing, for example. And so that some agencies may opt in to do this on a regular basis. And what do we know about the feedback from proficiency testing with respect to errors that people make on the tests? Do you have any of that info?
Yeah. So this was a little study that I did because the benefit of looking at proficiency tests is you have a lot of people who take them. And the proficiency test providers are very kind, and they provide manufacturer statements. So you essentially know how those patterns were created, and then they also provide the answers. There are two companies out there, at least in the United States, that do proficiency tests in bloodstain pattern analysis. There's a third company that's over in New Zealand and Australia that also does it. The group in New Zealand and Australia does it fundamentally differently than the two in the US. So I'm just really going to talk about the two in the US because they've been around a lot longer, and it's a bit easier to look at these patterns. But when you compare the known mechanism with the supplied answers, and break it down into, did the person get it right or did they get it wrong, we start seeing some answers. When it comes to, and let's just talk about just error rates. Overall, with one company, the error rate was about 6%. And those could be spatter producing patterns or just non-spatter producing patterns. 6% of the time people got it wrong. And we break that down a little bit into spatter producing patterns, only spatter patterns. That had a higher rate. That was 10% of the time someone got it wrong. And that makes sense because those are the more complex patterns. You have different mechanisms that create patterns that look really, really similar. And if you are too specific, you run a real risk of getting the wrong answer, picking the wrong mechanism. For non-spatter patterns like transfers and swipes and voids and flows and pools, the error rate was significantly less. It was 2% of the time. So, but it's about 6% overall for pattern classification on this proficiency test. The second test provider has not been out as long. There's not as much data out there. The first group has over 12,000 respondents, so it's a significantly bigger sample size. The second group has only about 630 respondents, and their results are about the same. Their error rate is 1.7% overall, and their spatter patterns are a little less than 1%. Their non-spatter patterns is actually 2%, which is interesting because we have a flip in reversal there. And it's because some of them, in their case, they had some outliers. You know, if you don't have a large sample size and you have a pattern that may be a bit difficult and a lot of people get it wrong, that a lot of people could be 4 people. And then what happens is you kind of over magnify that result. So over the years, as this test provider has more and more people take their test, I think those numbers are going to average out.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I've seen some of the images from one of the tests, and in some cases they're not that hard.
Right.
So so that's the other thing I wanted to bring out there is
Yes.
that there are different levels of, you know, hey, here's a test and you kind of do it. So when we start getting into overlapping patterns or patterns that are, you know, more complex, then I'm sure that number would probably start to climb a little bit.
Right.
Yeah. Okay. And also, can you comment? Yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah. If you don't appreciate uncertainty and you don't account for uncertainty, if you think I've got to provide an answer, a very definitive answer, then once you get into those overlapping patterns, it's like putting a bunch of words on top of themselves. Then you at some point you can't read what's there.
Right.
But
yeah. So the thing that I was going to say was the more recently fabrics has become a big deal, right? So fabrics, and when we talk about different courses, actually somebody has a question here. Maybe we can answer this here, but he's saying suggestions for advanced training after a basic 40-hour course. And I think some of that has to do with the complexities of cases that have been coming up because the David Cam case, Joe Bryan case, and other things where things have gone wrong. But what kind of courses can you suggest? And do these courses address some of the more complex problems that an analyst can run into?
Yeah. So there are multiple advanced workshops out there. I would take more than one advanced, and they're just titled Advanced Topics in Bloodstain Pattern Analysis. I would take more than one from different instructors. The reason being is then you get different perspectives from that. And in the different advanced course, most people's basic course is generally the same. The IAI and the IBPA kind of lay out standard criteria that need to be in a basic introductory workshop. But the advanced ones is really kind of up to the instructor on the direction that they want to take. So multiple advanced courses is good. I would absolutely recommend the fluid dynamics. It's heavy on the science, but it is absolutely outstanding. The disadvantage is that it's not offered very often, and the instructors that have typically taught it have been from Australia and New Zealand. So in our pandemic era, that has been really shut down for 2 years. But once we come out from that cloud, if you're able to take the fluid dynamics one, I would absolutely recommend that. The fabrics one is another one. If you find yourself looking at fabrics more, looking at clothing and even on, that's really the big thing, looking at clothing, I would take a fabrics course because I think your eyes are going to be opened about how much you really don't know when blood interacts with textiles.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things I said to somebody once was you walk out of the fabrics course knowing what you don't know. It's all about what you don't know, where you can get into trouble. Yeah. The other thing I think that's important for training, and I don't know if there are any programs that you have in some of these, but well, 2 things. One you touched on before, which was testing, like running your own tests and then doing research. I think that's a super important point because, like you said, you have these moments where you're looking at something going, I would have never guessed, like I would have
Right.
been able to produce that kind of stain. And so again, it's reinforcing that don't be so sure of yourself.
Right.
And the other thing is mentorship. And I think that's
Hmm.
really, really important to have somebody, looking over your shoulder saying, just be careful there, or this,
Yeah.
having that experience transfer is really important. So I don't know if there's any programs like that where you can ask for a mentor, but I guess some agencies maybe help out with that, or
Yeah, there are a couple of analysts who do offer mentorship programs. It's like an official mentorship program that they have within their kind of private agency. Our laboratory, it, let's think of it this way. Let's set BPA aside and you look at every other forensic science out there. Every other forensic science out there, fingerprints, footwear, firearms, drug chemistry, biology, uses some form of a mentorship program. They have a defined training program where you watch other analysts. They guide you through this process. You pick up on tricks of the trade. You never ever take a single intro to DNA workshop and signed off on casework. It just doesn't work that way. If we're going to consider BPA as science, we must be all in, and we must consider this like any other discipline that's out there, which means a defined regimented training program where you pair yourself up with someone who is experienced, who guides you along that process. We haven't done that as much as what we ought to.
okay. Yeah, that's fair enough. I want to ask you about a paper that was written, and I believe it's fairly recent, last year or
Hmm.
so. And
Yeah.
so, accuracy and reproducibility of conclusions by forensic bloodstain pattern analysis. Is this part of what we was called the black box study? Is that what people were
Yes.
referring to before? Is it okay? So, what can you tell me about some of the conclusions here about how well people perform on different types of patterns?
So this is, I think, probably the fifth study that came out, but it's certainly the largest study that looked into the accuracy and consistency and reproducibility of pattern classification conclusions. But the answers were very similar to what has been published before, and it's about 11%, about 10%. The study on a study that came out that looked at just classifications on bloodstains on non-porous smooth surfaces, it was 13%. Study on fabrics, it was about 23%, but if you throw out a problematic pattern, then that dropped it down to 14%. The proficiency test is about 10%, and here they found an overall rate of error is around 11%. So it falls in line with that, and we can split that apart a little bit more about reasons for those errors, but they looked at how often individual analysts were very definitive in their conclusion and saying it's absolutely this pattern or it is absolutely not this pattern versus, well, you know what, I really don't know, kind of that indeterminate. And what they found is that the more conclusive you were, the more likely you were to make an error. In fact, there was one participant in this study that was conclusive like over 80% of the time, and they were wrong 36% of the time, and they accounted for 5% of the overall errors of the entire study. And then there was another analyst that like 80% of the time just said, I don't know. And so they had a when they did give an answer, they were right most of the time, but we kind of have to find that middle ground. If you look at the published study, a lot of analysts their inconclusive rate was between about 20 and 60% of the time. 40% was kind of a sweet spot. And once you start moving beyond that, specifically becoming more and more definitive, then you're really running a risk of increasing the number of times you get it wrong. In fact, one of the subject matter experts who was part of the study design commented, saying, "I was surprised that analysts weren't more indeterminate, that they felt like they went beyond what the evidence allowed."
Mm-hmm.
So that's one of the things that we can pull from that is this awareness that probably more often than what we think, our answer is, I don't know. Now that I don't know can still be giving some form of a conclusion. We can be saying it's spatter, but we don't know what kind of spatter. Is it impact? Is it projected? Is it expiration? I don't know. It's airborne blood, but beyond that, I don't know. So being more comfortable that that is the correct answer.
Right.
They also found one of the other study concepts that I thought was really interesting is that the masses, even though individuals may have made multiple mistakes, the masses got it right the vast majority of the time. For what they called most consequential patterns, when you looked at the majority opinion, it was always right. So one of their recommendations then is to use that to our advantage in casework and do tech review, or and maybe not just single tech review, maybe do a couple of different tech reviews, do a verification followed by a technical review, because the more eyes you get on that, the more likely you are that the group consensus is going to be the ground truth. So I'm a big proponent of technical review. It's part of my methodology that I use, also what I teach. Because that's that falsification step of science, giving my report and my data to someone else and asking them to look for ways that I'm wrong.
Right.
You got to be in a right spot mentally to ask someone to tell you that you're wrong.
Well, and it's part of a process, like you're saying. If you're following a scientific method, then you're observing. You're kind of reviewing the data. You have to make some. You can maybe do some kind of analysis, or there's different things you do. And so you have to follow that entire process, which I think is really important. And if somebody doesn't follow the process, or let me ask the question this way: what are some of the reasons why analysts or practitioners make errors, in casework?
Oh, there's all kinds of answers for that. And this is where we have to do what happens too often is they say it's junk science. And they say, well, all these errors were made, and that just means that the science is bad. And we just don't do that. That's not the best. Now, that could be the answer. Okay, that could be the answer, but I'm confident that that's not the answer in BPA. But let's look at some reasons why an error could be made. One is that they're using a bad method. That the approach that they're taking is wrong. Well, what do I mean by a bad method? If you, before you walk into a scene, if you gather everything about that case, what did the victim say? What did the suspect say? What are your theories? And you gather all this information, you've allowed other people to tell you the story before the bloodstains tell you the story. And so now you've been given a lot of information that is absolutely unnecessary. And there's a couple of papers that have demonstrated that means that you get it wrong sometimes, because that extra information guides you to the wrong answer. So that method is different than, like, the method that we use is I go in blind. For myself and my colleague, we go in blind. We try not to have any of that information because we want the bloodstains to tell their own story. Those are two fundamentally different methods. So your method could be wrong. The analysts may also be unqualified. That they just they didn't have the proper training. They don't have the proper background. So they just aren't qualified, and that could be the source of the method. Or it could be the right method, and they could be qualified, but they just applied it wrong. They made a mistake in the application in their method. So that could be a third reason. And another reason is that with is inherent in every scientific process is that the method just missed it. The person was qualified, the method was correct, the method was appropriately applied, and they just got it wrong. And then at that point, take a step back and say, why did we get it wrong? And sometimes we find out is because we found out that that's a gap in our knowledge, in our institutional and discipline knowledge, that pattern fell within that gap, so we can learn from it.
Yeah, that makes sense. And there's an interesting question here. Again, I'll bring this up, and it's it talks about the hive mind, but it talks about artificial intelligence. And is anyone looking at artificial intelligence for pattern classification? And actually, the research study, Gareth Griffiths, and I think he's on the chat here, but he's also doing some work in this area. But I'm wondering, is there any advanced methods that people are looking at, whether it's looking at advanced ways of a process of making a decision, or how the analysts can do better?
Right. There are a couple of studies that have been looking into that. These are really foundational studies. There's one study that talked about eye tracking, looking at eye tracking, and here's a pattern, and now track the analyst's eyes. What areas did they focus on the most? What areas did they not look at? And with the assumption that if an analyst spends a lot of time looking at an area, then that area is very important to the classification of that pattern. So that kind of gives you an idea of what elements are important. But there are some machine learning papers that have come out, and these are really, really basic, looking at two different patterns, a cast-off pattern and an impact pattern. Can we feed these algorithms multiple examples of different kinds of these two known patterns, where it creates its machine learning process that then can do automated classification? And then other analysts have come up with other mathematical approaches that I've read the papers. I've tried to work through them. I don't fully understand, but they're building that foundational approach to using machine learning and AI to it. The issue, at least when people have talked with me about machine learning, is it requires vast amounts of real data that have to be input into that. And what we're finding is I can give you experimental patterns, but those are not reflective all the time of actual casework patterns. And sometimes the way that we make experimental patterns simply do not mimic what real casework patterns look like. Impact patterns are an example of that, and really forward and back spatter patterns. There's just no way experimentally to accurately recreate those patterns. So we're getting there, but there's a lot of work. But when it comes to that hive thing, create your own small hive. Do that tech review, run it by, like, if you have like 5 people in your agency that are signed off on BPA, keep one set aside so that they're their tech reviewer, so they look at it blind, and then ask the others for help. That is a good process of that method. Yeah, you can take advantage of it in a lot of different ways, but AI is in the future. People are working on it. I'm not sure we're quite there yet.
Yeah. Let me ask you about I should talk about a little bit about maybe area of origin, or maybe some of the more types of analysis which are actually a calculation. Where do you think we stand with some of, like, for example, area of origin? There's different software programs and all this other stuff, but is it good enough, or do we need to do better, or what do you think we need to do going forward in those areas?
For me, I think we're for practical application within casework and applying the meaning of that, I think where we need to be. That assumes two things: one, that it's appropriately applied, and two, that the pattern is sufficient to come to that conclusion. We've come a long way from manually stringing and manual measurements. If you're still doing that, I encourage you to look at some of the other software-driven ways of doing this. There is Hemospath that's out there. There's also a program called Sherlock that I think Trent University has published some validation papers on it. Both of those deal with directional analysis. You take select individual stains, you measure the locations of those stains, you photograph those stains, and then you input that data into these programs, do best fit ellipsing within the program, and that draws virtual strings. But that's all dependent on good quality stains that are present within the pattern, as well as proper stain selection. Garbage in, garbage out is what you're going to have. And then you have kind of been leading the way, as well as with others, in looking at 3D scanning and looking at extending that into the three-dimensional world, taking this 3D scan data, whether that be Faro, whether that be Leica. Both companies have had white papers and studies that published about it, and doing that same work using the 3D scan data. It could be the scan data coupled with photographs, but it's the same general concept: finding individual stains, getting the ellipses of those stains as well as the directionalities, and extending virtual strings backward. When we look at when the right stains are selected, what we get is an area, and we'll get kind of a standard deviation from that. It could be a Hemospat calculated standard deviation, or it could be a measurement of uncertainty that's calculated based on other processes.
And what we're finding is we're getting that, what we have always said, it's kind of within like a basketball or a volleyball area. Well, what's the most important determination with area of origin? Were they standing upright? Were they non-upright? Or were they on the floor? Yeah, does it matter if my area is 3 inches versus 6 inches? Generally, it's not. I can still tell you, are they standing up? The other question of how many impacts, maybe we could make some more progress on that. In that regard, there's only one study that I know of that has really looked into that. And what they found is that you kind of have to have about 6 inches of separation in the X, Y, or Z to be able to consistently differentiate two different impacts from one another. But overall, to put the pattern into the reconstructive case conclusion, meaning I think we're there. We could do additional work on it. People looked at ballistic trajectories and so on to kind of tighten that up. But it'll add some value. I just don't know how much more value it will add.
Yeah, that makes sense. Are there any areas that you're working on right now that you can talk about in terms of research or things that you want to move forward in?
We have virtually not touched case conclusions at all. And the case conclusions are, what does this mean? So here I've got a pattern. Let's say I've got impact, like 3 impact patterns, a cast-off patterns, and some transfer stains. Now the question becomes, what does that mean? And those can be the case conclusions. And it's like, where were people standing? How did people move within a scene? Can we sequence specific patterns? Can we tell anatomical positions? Can we determine if a decedent, can we look at stains on their body and tell if that body has been manipulated or moved after those bloodstains were created? Those people have called them reconstructive conclusions or case conclusions. There virtually has been no published studies on those. And there are times where those are the most contentiously debated conclusions within juries. It's not that, hey, this is an impact pattern and this is a spatter stain. Is what does it mean? I think we need to start considering looking into those and looking into what kinds of conclusions are appropriate, what conclusions are inappropriate. And once we have defined what conclusions are appropriate, then start developing these black box studies to kind of gain an insight of how much variability and consistency and accuracy we have in the community right now. Just kind of like what the pattern classification black boxes have done.
Right, for sure. Well, look, I think that's almost it. And I just want to say, if people have any questions, there were a couple of things here. One of them, let me bring it up here. But it had to do with, see if I can get to some of the questions here. I got to scroll up now because there's a few comments here. But one had to do with how do you analyze, I'll bring it up. How do you analyze blood patterns under conditions of humid weather? Kindly elaborate scientific foundations of BPA. And maybe that's a question for extreme weather conditions. What about when you have rain? What about when you have snow and ice? And because where we are here, ice is a real thing. So any thoughts there?
Yeah, it changes your features for sure. On ice, I went out to one scene where the blood flash froze on, it was like in Fahrenheit, it was 4 degrees Fahrenheit outside, and the blood flash froze on the surface. And instead of that red-brown stain, it became pink. And I was standing right next to a metal pole that had blood all up and down it, and I thought it was just painted. I didn't realize that it was blood. I've also, in very hot and humid weather, we had a scene where we had a blood stain that was outside, and it was a 95-degree Fahrenheit day outside. I watched that blood stain turn from red-brown to black in a matter of hours. So the humid conditions, if we were to get to the point where we were to make time of deposition or age of blood stain determinations, that's where it's going to be most impactful. We are not there yet. That's like the holy grail of a lot of people, to see how old is that blood stain. We are not there yet in most situations. Humidity, sometimes depending on the substrate, you can have weather conditions that would cause that blood to fall off or to flake off. It would change the color of that. If you have rainy weather, then you start altering and those bloodstains are outside and exposed to that moisture, then you start altering the features of that. And then what happens is all you can say is it's a blood stain, because the features that are most essential for your analysis are going to be changed. There are a few studies out there about blood stains that are affected by fire and soot deposition, and how to visualize those and interpret those. But effects of weathering, yes, they can potentially affect it. We don't have a huge amount of published data out there. We probably have a lot of anecdotal data out there. But it really just kind of depends.
Yeah, depends on the situation. We have another question from Gareth Griffiths. So Gareth from the UK, he's asking about the AI, some of the AI systems that he uses. They will give you a certain probability of an image being a specific pattern. So what do you think is an acceptable allowance, or what would be useful or not useful?
Oh boy. I'm going to say I don't know if we're there yet. That kind of gets into the discussion of like probabilities and numerical values and confidence levels for classifications, and we haven't even really scratched the surface on that. I know that there's been at least one published paper when it comes to area of origin determinations, where it uses a fluid dynamics model, and it creates a density graph where red areas are higher probability, and as you get further out, the colors change. So it gives you an overall area of depiction of where that area of origin could be, but as probabilities increase, the colors change. So you can kind of use that as information, but as far as coming up with a threshold of saying, okay, this is the necessary cutoff, I'm not sure that we're there yet. And even biology and DNA analyses have walked away from an absolute cutoff for identification. It's like, these are the numbers. Yes, they are ridiculously high, but we have removed all cutoffs, at least at our lab, all cutoffs. We don't say to the scientific degree of certainty, this number's high enough to say it absolutely came from this person.
Okay.
So we're not quite there yet.
Well, research, right? That's important. And well, and speaking of research, you are the editor for the Journal of Bloodstain Pattern Analysis. So,
yes,
and I can see on the list here, I think there's some people here that are currently doing research. So are you guys looking still for papers?
Absolutely. And I know that the Journal of Bloodstain Pattern Analysis is not like the larger forensic journals. I get that. We're not like Journal of Forensic Identification or Forensic Science International. So, and I know that there is a level of prestige that comes in getting a paper published in those. And we're not there, and I'm not sure if we're ever going to get there. But if you want your research to target just bloodstain pattern analysts, we are the journal for you. If you have questions about the validity of our vetting process, I want to help alleviate those concerns. My approach as editor is I will not publish anything sent my way. I go through a true blind peer review process. That I have multiple technical individuals who will do a technical and peer review of all manuscripts that are submitted to me. The authors and any identifying information is removed from those manuscripts that are
Oops, I'm not sure if there's a little cutoff here. But I can't hear Jeremy anymore, so I'm not sure if he's still there. Let's see if he can make it back here. Oh, not sure. Yeah, let's try this just for a few seconds and see if he bounces back. Actually, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to remove that there and see if he can come back here in a minute. He's still here on my end somehow, so he hasn't dropped off completely just yet. But, oh, looks like he may be cut off here. Well, I'll tell you what. We're getting on in time here, and it's right at the end, and it's too bad that Jeremy just got cut off there at the very end, but we were getting close to the end anyway. So I want to thank everybody for their attention and for putting some of the questions in the chat window as well. I was in fact going to add this here. So with respect to the Journal of Bloodstain Pattern Analysis, you can always go to the IABPA website. That's just iabpa.org. And if you go there, they have, if you go under resources, it'll say Journal of Bloodstain Pattern Analysis, and you can get over there. And you can see that it has the editor, Jeremiah Morris, and you can just there's a submission form there. So you can always go out that way. And actually, I see Jeremy has just popped back in here. Hey, there you are.
Yeah, sorry about that.
Hey, no problem. Yeah, so you got cut off there just about, you were talking about the process of the JBPA.
Yeah, so we do a true double-blind peer review process. I send it out to technical reviewers, and they don't know who the authors of the manuscripts are. I have more than one, and sometimes I've had 3 or 4. And they send me their comments, and then I strip all identifying information from those comments, send it back to the original authors, and we have multiple recommendations ready for publication with, or they have to do some additional work, or it's not fit for publication. So when we publish something in the journal, it is my goal that it is of high quality, that it has gone through a vetting process, that it's good research, it's a good manuscript, and that people who read those can have confidence in the quality of the content and of the material.
Okay. Now, if somebody wants to get hold of you, can they? There's the JBPA submission form. I don't know if that goes through there, or if you're on the website at all, or maybe they can just go through there. But does it go right to you when they submit?
It can, or the best way is just to email me directly. And my email is forensicbpa@gmail.com. It's all
Okay.
forensicbpa, all one word, @gmail.com, and that's the best way to get a hold of me to submit manuscripts.
Excellent. Okay, great. Well, look, Jeremy, I want to thank you so much. Like, I appreciate all your insight and all the work that you're doing, because I know it's a lot of work on the editing
My pleasure.
and all that. So and appreciate your input here. So thanks very much for being here. All
My
right.
pleasure.
Hang back when you get a chance. Just hang back for a second.
Will do.
All right. Well, look, everybody. Yeah, thanks so much. I just want to bring up, don't forget, there's the photogrammetry class that's coming up. There's the IAFSM conference that's coming up. There is the IABPA website. Make sure that you get over there and make sure you have a look. There's information there. The journal has a lot of really good information there. And there's different studies and things like that that can be of value to you as well. So on that note, I want to say thanks a lot, everyone. Really appreciate everything, and we'll see you soon. See you next week. We'll be here. Take care. Bye-bye.